Hey there, Heather, ho there, it's Jeff Cutter Diamond. Welcome you to yet another Cutter Top 10 sports video. And today, of course, is with me rocking the Alouettes shirt. Oh, that the only shirt you'll see me in a Montreal outfit with. We're going to be talking about the top 10 worst CFL teams of all time. Now, CFL has had some great times by all and have had some very bad moments. But the fact of the matter is that the CFL has had some clunkers and all that. So anyhow, we're going to be looking at the list, and there are going to be a few teams on this list that stink, have multiple losers, if you will. Number 10 is the Alouettes / Concords of the 1980s. The Alouettes suffered a massive moment when they just couldn't do well in the 1980s. By 1986, they were flat. The Alouettes franchise would be turned into the Montreal Concords. And it just didn't feel the same for CFL in Montreal, even though they were playing games at Stade Olympique, like Olympic Stadium, which had a high capacity. Fans just weren't coming out to the games and all that. So practically, Montreal was doomed. And in 1987, just days before the season started, the Alouettes / Concords would fold, and CFL football in Montreal would be gone for 9 years. 9 years. Like everyone knows about Ottawa and losing their team for like 6, 7 years, but Montreal lost for 9 before they were brought back in 1986. The only reason why the Alouettes had a team in the first place was due to the fact that the CFL US experiment had blown up in everyone's face. So that meant that, they couldn't have American teams. The only key American team, the Baltimore Stallions, as they call them, actually were going to leave Baltimore in the first place because Baltimore got the NFL back after the Browns moved to Baltimore. So Baltimore had no use for the CFL team, but thankfully Jim Spaniels managed to get the team to Montreal, and CFL football was back in Montreal, and it actually brought a boom to the Alouettes franchise. Well, I mean, having almost all the Baltimore guys, they were making things happen. Number 9 is the 1997 Rough Riders. Saskatchewan Rough Riders, that is. They were 3-15. The 97 team massively limped and all that. They were terrible and all that. They just couldn't do anything. Oh, my stats should be wrong because the 97 Rough Riders got to the final against the Argos. I think it was 1996. But yeah, the 96 team limped to a 3-15 finish. They had a bad offense and a lack of stability at quarterback. And that was, of course, the year before they went to the Grey Cup unexpectedly against the Argos and were victimized. Number 8 are all the U.S. teams in the CFL except for Baltimore. Got to put this on the list as a continuation because, I mean, the CFL in the U.S. was weird because the American thing was just to gain money, so to help the CFL out. Of course, it was awkward because remember when the World Football League actually wanted to put a team in Canada in 1934, and the Canadian government basically said that no way, we're going to put some kind of Sports Measures Act, which meant that John Bassett, who is owner of the Toronto World Football League team, would have had to pay dearly for it because, he was one of the richest men in Canada, and, there would have been a lot of sanctions. They just wanted to protect the CFL. Fair, but then the CFL decided to go to the States, and America probably didn't think that was a good idea. I mean, the U.S. having to deal with Canada's 110 yards from end zone to end zone. 55 yards in the offense zone, 55 in the defense, and 20-yard end zones. It was like, how could you have a stadium that you got to build for 130 yards of football, whereas in the NFL it's practically 120. No, that can't be right. The 20 yards, so 150, whatever. Nevertheless, the CFL in the U.S. just didn't have any great teams like San Antonio, Shreveport, Birmingham, Las Vegas, Miami even almost had a team. Who am I missing? I'm missing a few. Well, Baltimore, obviously, but they don't count because Baltimore got to the Grey Cup in both 94 and 95. So, yeah, the CFL in the US was just weird and all that. There were some CFL stars who actually played it in the south of the border and actually did much better later on in their careers, but that's just not there. Number 7 is the anemic 0-16 1954 Calgary Stampeders. The Stampeders just couldn't do anything in 1954. 1954 was one of the best seasons in the CFL because that got everyone thinking about things. And we had that great Grey Cup between Edmonton and Montreal, the third one ever televised. And I believe the second one, was it the first one or the second one that was nationally televised? I think it was the first one. When Montreal apparently lost the game on a Hunsinger backward pass, which was a fumble, and Jackie Parker ran it in for the touchdown for Edmonton to win the game 26-25. But Hunsinger said that it was a forward pass that would have made it incomplete. Anyway, the 1954 Stampeders were bad, and this was also the season in which the Ontario Rugby League, Rugby Football Union, would bring a team to the Grey Cup semifinals, and that was Kitchener, but they got romped by Edmonton. Look it up, people. Number 6 is the Ottawa Red Blacks from 2014. Now, to be fair, Ottawa had been up against it. Their CFL history plays worse than Montreal's CFL history, despite the fact that Ottawa's won more Grey Cups. The Ottawa Rough Riders had some problems, and we'll get to that. One of the top 5 is a Rough Riders team. But anyway, the Red Blacks came in 2014. They were an expansion team. Ottawa had CFL football for like 3-4 years in the 2000s and then stopped. And then they finally restarted again in 2014. They were 2-16. They had the difficulty of being an expansion franchise. They couldn't compete in close games. They had a lackluster offense. Their field was good too. It was kind of cool. And one of the fields that would have hosted the FIFA Women's World Cup in 2015. But the fact is, they sucked. But there is a rags to riches story about this franchise because 2 years later, just 2 years later, in 2016, the Red Blacks were in the Grey Cup finals against the Calgary Stampeders, and everyone thought Calgary was going to stomp all over Ottawa. But no, Ottawa forced Calgary to play in overtime and won in overtime. Number 5 is the 2013 Winnipeg Blue Bombers. They had a dreadful season. They had several quarterbacks, inconsistent play. And, Winnipeg nowadays, like you look at things 10 plus years later, is that they're one of the most powerful teams in the West. And they're pretty good. Spoiler alert, this is actually the worst season by a team from the West Coast, from the Western Division, because the top 4 are from the East. So, nevertheless, it was just not too easy to be a Blue Bomber fan at that time in the 2010s. Number 4 is the 91 Ottawa Rough Riders. This won't be the last time I talk about the Ottawa Rough Riders as a franchise, but yeah, this team sucked. They were 1-17. 1-17. They coaching stability, roster turnover. They had not really good players and all that. I'm just going to look at the roster for the 1991 Ottawa Rough Riders. Because, it's just not really the best season around. 1-17. So, yeah. They tried everything in their power, but they failed miserably. And all that. So, I mean, they tried everything to get their team to be strong, but they failed miserably. Number 3 is the 1981 Toronto Argonauts. the Argonauts franchise was supposed to be one of great power and all that to Eastern Canada, but Toronto had some downfalls. In the early 70s, they were decent. They had a chance to win the 1971 Grey Cup, but Liam McQuaid fumbled in the wet turf of Vancouver. The Argos had some terrible momentum in 1981. It was one of the worst seasons in boatman history. All of that. So, anyway, it was a tough season for the Argos. They won 2 games against Calgary and Montreal late in the season and lost to Hamilton on the final day to be 2-14. But what was even more crazy is how crapola the East was in 1981. Sure, Hamilton was 11-4-1, which was pretty good. And Ottawa were 5-11. Yeah, Ottawa was second, 5-11. Montreal third at 3-13, and Toronto 2-14. Now, Canadians know about this thing called the crossover rule, but it did not apply in 1981. It was 1987 that they made that rule. So, because of that, the worst team in the West could not join the East and make their playoffs and all that. In fact, Montreal had to beat Ottawa to avoid being 2-14 themselves. Montreal and Toronto both at 2-14. That would have been crazy because the third place was actually the fact that the Argos scored more points head to head with Montreal. They would have made the playoffs at 2-14. But Montreal were 3-13, made the playoffs, faced the 5-11 Rough Riders in the Eastern semis. Ottawa won that, and then Ottawa shockingly beat Hamilton to get to the 1981 Grey Cup and almost upset Edmonton, almost. But yeah, the 1981 Argos were just in a bad situation. You know that Cedric Minter was a good player. But this is another rags to riches story because in 1982, the Argos did better. So much so, they actually were the Eastern champions to face Edmonton and try to deny Edmonton a fifth straight Grey Cup, which didn't happen. The Argos lost that game in what they call the Rain Bowl because of all the crapola that happened. So, yeah. And number 2 is the 1996 Ottawa Rough Riders. Again with the Rough Riders, but yeah, 96 was the final chapter for this team. Ottawa had a good Canadian football following for many decades, but by the 90s, their ownership had problems. A Chicago chicken restaurant chain owner was the guy who was the owner of the Rough Riders and all that. They had off-field turmoil, frequent coaching changes, and the instability was just terrible. They won 3 games and they couldn't do any better. All that. So anyway, Jim Gilstrap was fired with John Payne there too. Yeah, the Rough Riders just had nothing. They beat BC, Montreal, and Saskatchewan. They were 3-8 actually. They weren't that half bad, but then they lost 7 straight games, including 2 to Calgary and 2 to Montreal. So that was the problem. They just had nothing going for them. Lamar McGriggs was a good linebacker. They seemed to do okay, but they couldn't do okay, and they fumbled the way through the season. They were 3-15, and Ottawa was done for. They folded, and there's no CFL football in that city for 6 years. So it's kind of a pity, don't you think? And number one is the worst team in CFL modern history, the 2003 Hamilton Ticats. They started off optimistic and all that. I mean, Ron Lancaster is a legendary head coach and a legendary player if you're a Saskatchewan Roughriders fan. He was great in all that. So they had some good guys. Julian Randling was a good running back and all that. They didn't win the preseason, but who cared? But yeah, 2003 was modern. They beat Saskatchewan in overtime on home turf on September 12th, which was the 14th week. Well, the 13th game of the season. So they were 1-12, and then the rest of their campaign they lost 5 straight games and all that. It was just sad to see Ron Lancaster being a legendary player slash coach in the CFL falling to 1-17. It was the worst winning percentage in CFL modern history with decimal 0.59. I mean, for how bad, like a lot of teams like Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal were back in the day, Hamilton still had the fewest wins while they were 1-17. That was just painful and all that. To see and all that. They conceded more than 270 points, more than they scored. So that was just anemic. And the Steel City really took a massive hit and all that. They have bounced back with a few Grey Cup appearances, but no major titles for a few years. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond. I do.